Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
I'm not sure if you would have heard this, but I recently got married. Mazel tov, maybe? Shout out Mazel tov? Or woo woo, that's fine too. And it was just as I had hoped. 3 weeks ago, I stood almost exactly where I am right now, under a chuppah, with my now husband, Elon. And it was incredible. After 7 years of officiating at almost 200 weddings, it was finally my turn to break a glass, or 2 glasses with Elon, and to hear the room shout out Mazel Tov. That night, I commented to a friend who is also a rabbi that when I heard the cheers of Mazel Tov, I imagined an unbroken chain of thousands of years of my ancestors hearing those same words at their weddings. At which point, my friend pointed out that actually Mazel Tov is a relatively modern Jewish phrase, and only maybe 7 or 8 generations of my ancestors would have said those words at weddings. He missed the point. But it turns out that he was right. Most scholars believe that Mazel Tov came into common Jewish parlance in the 19th or maybe in the 18th century. Prior to that, the phrase by itself doesn't appear in any Jewish texts. Mazal did not mean luck in the same way for earlier generations. But we do find an antecedent in Talmudic Hebrew where the word mazalot refers to constellations of stars, ergo the meaning of luck in an astrological sense, which is to say what's written in the stars. They might not have shouted Mazel Tov at wedding couples, but the Talmudic sages were well acquainted with mazalot in the form of astrology. The zodiac emerged as a concept in Babylonia 5 centuries before the earliest rabbis hit the scene, during which time many Jews began to believe in astrological predestination. But that certainly didn't mean the rabbis approved. In Tractate Brachot, we read Rabbi Yochanan's terse but scathing critique of astrology. Ein mazal Yisrael, he announces. There is no constellation that influences the Jewish people. Another sage, Rabbi Yehuda, comes in to bolster this point. How do we know for sure, he asks, that there is no astrology determining the fate of the Jewish people? He goes on to tell a story about the moment in Genesis when God promises Abraham that his offspring will be as numerous as the stars. According to this midrash, Abraham turns to God and says, "That's impossible. That's not what I read in my horoscope." That is literally in the text. You can look it up. And God replies, "Ma datcha, what are you thinking? You really think that you can't have children because Jupiter is positioned a certain way?" And in that moment, God repositioned Jupiter to prove the point. The rabbis go on like this for a while, repeating the phrase, Ein mazal Yisrael. There is no constellation, no astrology, no fate for the Jewish people. They tell other stories too, about the ability of prayer to change the outcome of a person's life and the role of tzedakah, charity, to reorient the constellations as well. You may recognize in that sugya the origins of a much later text that we'll come back to over these holidays, that repentance, prayer, and charity temper the decree of one's judgment. And the argument these rabbis are trying to make is clear. Some people might be ovdei, kochavim, umazalot, worshippers of the stars and constellations, who believe that the course of one's life is predetermined. But Jews resist that belief, insisting instead that there's always something you can do, however small, to change the outcome of your life. True as that was in Talmudic times, that belief remains at the core of Judaism today. Even if we do like to say Mazel Tov after something awesome, we don't actually believe that a person's fate is determined by the mazalot. For much of our tradition across centuries of debate, the dominant voice has been clear. Jews should reject the idea of predetermination or predestiny. Even if our natural abilities and our lifespans are beyond our control, say the rabbis in Tractate Nidah, how we live is up to us. God might see everything, Pirkei Avot teaches, but free will is given to us nonetheless. I have set before you life and death, says God in Deuteronomy, so that you may choose life and live. Again and again, our tradition takes pains to point out that even within the confines of so much that is beyond our power, we can always make a choice towards blessing in our lives. Now, we may rationally know that our lives are ours to craft, our decisions, our commitments, our paths. But sometimes it's hard to really feel like that's true. We live lives that feel at times totally beyond our control in a world that feels even more so. How many times have we lamented that such and such outcome is inevitable, that the worst is definitely going to happen and that there's simply nothing that we can do about it? Sometimes that really is true. And I'm here to tell you in my wise old age that many times it's not. I hope it's not too saccharine or schmaltzy to share that at a different Rosh Hashanah not that long ago, I felt absolutely certain that chuppah under which I stood was never going to happen. I had a sense that I wanted to one day be married, but at the end of an earlier relationship, that joyous vision felt impossibly far away. Now, you may be sitting there shifting in your chairs thinking, that's ridiculous. A rabbi so charming, so handsome. Give me a break. But you're my shul. Of course you're supposed to say that. In all seriousness, during the Chagim of 2020, when all of us were feeling bereft in the darkest days of COVID, I did genuinely believe that there was simply no way that I would ever experience that joy, that it was inevitable that I would remain in some state of yearning and sadness forever. Surely many of us can relate to that feeling, that something we want will never materialize, and sometimes, unfortunately, that is the case. But I'm increasingly convinced that the feeling of inevitability, for good or bad, is unhelpful in either case. That same human impulse to declare something inevitable when we are really speaking from sadness or fear or exhaustion or shame shows up not only in our personal lives, but also in the way we've grown accustomed to speaking about the trajectory of our world. Convinced that the worst will happen and utterly confident, of course, that we are right. The late behavioral economist and psychologist Daniel Kahneman described confidence as a feeling, specifically a feeling which reflects the coherence of information and the cognitive ease of processing it. Though we might think that confidence or certainty is an expression of intellect or wisdom, in his words, declarations of high confidence mainly tell you that an individual has constructed a coherent story in his mind, not necessarily that that story is true. And yet confidence, even about the worst possible outcome, can feel strangely comforting and protective. If we are convinced that a disaster is coming, at least that conviction can feel steadier than the instability of not knowing. And it's for that reason, I think, that so many of the loudest voices today carry with them an aura of certainty, even about despair. We live now in a cultural moment that insists that the best days are behind us, and that the future is a hellscape of fascism, inequity, and climate change. This is, of course, possible, more possible than we would have thought a decade ago. But it isn't as inevitable as public discourse might make it seem. Perhaps because so many norms have been broken and people of all political perspectives have been battered by a barrage of failures over the last quarter century, yielding a host of bad feelings. Narratives about inevitability have become a core part of our collective psyche. They plague us, obviously, but they also give us a protective sheen, allowing us to feel strong in our otherwise limited or even impotent state. We hear things like, no matter how we vote, any hope of change is just an illusion. Or, who cares if we recycle? The climate has already warmed beyond repair. From a different side of the aisle, we hear that family values have eroded so deeply that American civilization is doomed to collapse. And from people of all political stripes, we hear vis-a-vis Israel that the peace process is dead. So why should we believe that peace is ever possible between Israelis and Palestinians? Whether or not these views are prevalent in this synagogue, they are the dominant opinions in our culture right now, and none of them, not one, is inherently true. These views persist because they're easier to accept than it might be to engage in a cheshbon hanefesh, what we're here to do during these holidays. A soulful accounting of what we can actually do to make some bit of difference in the world or in our lives. The political theorist Isaiah Berlin emphasized the personal responsibility that we abdicate when we indulge the illusion of what he called historical inevitability. In a 1953 lecture at the London School of Economics before an audience that had only recently lived through the Second World War, he argued that when people understand a historical event to be inevitable, especially in hindsight, they are expressing an emotional need, independent of any fact. A need for chaos to be ordered into boxes, and a need to feel distance from the horrors of the world. In his words, if the history of the world is due to the operation of identifiable sources other than free wills and free choices, then there's a tendency to say that not individuals, but larger entities are ultimately responsible. This, he argues, is an illusion. Berlin admits that there are so many things an individual cannot change about their circumstances, about their health, or even about their political reality. But he argues that when a person announces that any political outcome is inevitable, what they're really saying is that they're anxious or scared about the future. And instead of tending to that anxiety or fear, they deepen narratives of their own impotence, absolving of the responsibility to try. The cycle continues, and the prophecy of doom is self-fulfilled. The irony of inevitability narratives is that when we think something is unavoidable, sometimes we're actually engaging in a different kind of avoidance. It isn't exactly fun to say that the worst possible outcome is a certainty, but it's a lot easier to have an answer or an explanation in a world that is otherwise random or chaotic than it is to grapple instead with our own responsibilities or limitations or feelings. Friends, the era in which we are living, as we well know, is brutal. It's so much scarier than anything we faced before in our lifetimes. But before we allow ourselves to believe that all is already lost, following Berlin's analysis, we might instead tend to whatever emotions we're feeling, nurture them, soothe ourselves, and consider then genuinely what's actually possible amidst the creeping confines of political life. Over the coming days, we will return to a refrain about all the many things we cannot control. Who shall live and who shall die? Who shall be at peace and who disturbed? And we will also assert in that same prayer that no matter how long we have to live, we will fill our lives with the best possible choices. Though these words are the most iconic of high holiday words, right now they are especially countercultural and as true as they have ever been. We can't change the conditions of our lives, but as our rabbis tell us, the choices we make in our lives are not written in the stars. Maimonides put it this way: a person should not entertain the thesis held by total fools, he begins, never one to mince words, that at the time of a person's creation, the Holy One of blessing decrees whether they will be righteous or wicked. This is a lie. Each person, he says, is fit to be righteous like Moses or wicked like Jeroboam. And a person on their own initiative and decision tends to the path that they choose. Lest we think that Rambam is only speaking about the choices we make in our personal lives, remember that Moses led an entire people through the wilderness toward a promised land, and Jeroboam waged a civil war among our people, destroying the united Israel of David and Solomon. The implication per Rambam is that our choices actually can reverberate beyond ourselves, impacting the future of our people and of the world. I would understand if you are out there feeling right now like this lesson is too hard to hear this year. But it is the basic idea undergirding Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and these days in between. The premise of these 10 days is to wake us up from the fantasy that our story has already been written, to insist that repentance, prayer, and charity actually matter and can shape whatever comes next. Rosh Hashanah will inevitably come next year, but there's nothing inevitable about our choices between now and then. Despite how disappointing or terrifying we may feel, or the world may feel at times, may we push ourselves to choose lives of blessing and goodness, no matter what. And God willing, may those choices lead us to many chances to say Mazel Tov in the year to come. Shana Tova.